I would argue that you cannot change technologies of production without changing business and procurement models. Right? And we've known that for a while. Joan Woodward was doing work on that in Imperial in the 1950s. And, yeah.
Yeah.
If it is to do with procurement and this, that and the other, I mean, why is it that the UK seems to be behind the race versus a number of other countries? Is there a differential in terms of the procurement in, say, Japan or Germany or whatever, and ourselves, or is there planning agreements, or you know, what makes us behind the race?
So I think it's the way you set up your project, your program at the start. Procurement's a part of it, but you need to set up such that you've got a team around you who understand that things can be done in this way. You need some technical input early so that you can understand that things can be done differently. Because otherwise people will follow the traditional route. And the traditional route of our procurement means that you do generally a little bit of design and then another designer comes along and they follow the traditional route. I'd also say as you go back into what we're taught at university, etc., generally we're taught to do things in situ and on site. So there is an education piece here as well about, it's not just, we can't turn a tap as a client from going on site to off site. There needs to be in the supply chain an understanding of what that means as well. So I think there's a number of things, but a good starting point is a client who wants to do things a slightly different way, but then get the right technical experts around them such that then the procurement can follow at the right pace, the right way. I don't think there's anything from our perspective which procurement ultimately stops this change. It's a matter of small changes on all sorts of things.
Okay, hang on to procurement, but is there any other country that has got it right?
So I would say that there are pockets of excellence in the UK as there are elsewhere. So we had the Singaporean building BCA brought their construction industry over to Imperial precisely to learn about design for manufacturing, assembly and integrated digital delivery. Now Singapore itself does a lot of this, yeah. But they recognise that there are excellent projects in the UK. The question is, given that there are people doing this, why is everybody else not following? Yeah? And that is a question about business models, about procurement models that really enable this.
Morgan.
Thank you. I should declare my interest. I'm a non-executive director of Countryside Properties plc and vice chair of King's College. We've already touched on some of this. It'd be really useful if you could really expand for us on the issue of skills and what's the skill set in what we're talking about. How different is the skill set from the traditional skill set? And where are the gaps in the new skill set? Where are the gaps, or where are the opportunities? I mean, what's the good and the bad, in a sense, in the story of the gaps that we have currently in skills and what we would have for the future model?
Shall I go first?
Okay. Yeah.
So I think we've come from a world of craft and fitting. So there was a time of manufacturing when we built steam engines and locomotives where things weren't built precisely and things went together. You had to file a bit and then sort of adjust. So tolerances weren't really understood in the same way. We're still there really with construction at the moment, I think. And what we'll see is a diminution, if you like, of the fitting element, because as other colleagues said, well, you did, I think, Jennifer, if the tolerances are right, things will just fit together. Of course, it could be disastrous if the tolerances aren't right, because we still have fitting and modular construction. You really have to have it right first time. So I think the skills, there'll be a migration more towards design. Maybe some of the manual skills will go into these regional factories where they can still be used in a similar way, but equally there'll be an upskilling, I think, towards system engineering and design.
So we believe that systems engineering is important in this new environment, and so we're beginning to look at providing CPD around systems engineering out of Imperial and through UCRIC, which is the UK Collaboratorium, which does research on infrastructure in cities. I would say that there's also some there's a need for a fundamental research base here as we move to more digital fabrication techniques. And so there's opportunities around technologies like AI and robotics as we move forward, that I think it's important that we have the research base to support. So it's not a one-off transition in a sense. There's a transition that's required, and that's about business models, procurement models. But I think there's also the skill base that's going to support advanced manufacturing approaches to construction as we move forward into 2030, 2040, 2050.
How do you think we get young people who are currently at school, how do we excite them in thinking about this future? I ask it particularly because I've got to go early to go and speak to something about women in STEM, so I'm just wondering if there's something I can take from here. But I mean, seriously, it strikes me that in many ways this is potentially attractive to people who aren't currently attracted to this, to the industry. I wonder if there's any evidence of that yet, and what are the lessons for how we try and encourage young people at an early age to think about this?
I mean, I think the built environment is extremely exciting to young people, and they get the idea that this is about their houses, the roads that they walk on, the schools that they go to. You know, if they're unlucky enough to go to hospital, then the hospitals that they go to. So they understand that this is really about the world that they live in, and I think that the opportunity to make that at a higher level of quality. And to be able to think through how we put that together and how we operate it and maintain it long term is exciting to young people. So I think there's real opportunity to excite them about this.
So I think user-centric design is really interesting, isn't it? As you bring the user into the simulation of what it's going to be, so that there's much more creativity associated with the process rather than just being delivered and not being quite what you expected.
And there's a lot of cool technology that can play into that, right? So the artificial intelligence, the robotics, are cool areas of technology that start to begin to connect with this world.
I think the other side of this is that we still spend too much time explaining what fun it's to be on a construction site. That isn't the point, really. The point is that actually there's some really interesting work to create something which is then extremely easy to build, and that's the bit up in that, the sort of first stages of the work, rather than pictures on magazines of people in hard hats, which is what we still seem to trade, and I think we need to stop trading that, and actually people creating things on screens would be a much better way to try to explain to my kids anyway, that it's not all about muddy boots and those things.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
You didn't seem to be answer at all the question, what's wrong with the UK in this building? I mean, the French are building twice or even 3 times as many houses as we are. One of the arguments is that in France, I've been on committees looking at the French nuclear. I mean, they have centralised teams, or they have the organisation Point Chaussée for the roads. I mean, do you not think that, in fact, that the top structure, the planning structure, the organisational structure of the UK just doesn't match to this pretty efficient system you've got in France, where the houses come out and they're built and they don't fall down. Had my wife designed our own one in France. It works very good, but you haven't answered that question. You said there are expertise here and there and so on. But
question, though, I think that one, isn't it? Because it reflects back to Napoleon's time. Napoleon did some good things.
So tell us what you think.
Well, I think that centralised policy, when I was in DCLG as their chief scientist, we had regional spatial planning. So actually, somebody had a global idea of how the UK should be laid out. That seemed like a good idea to me, unpolitically, just from a rational point of view. But if you've got linear assets like rail lines to build, then you plan that holistically. It's a tiny country we've got after all, so why wouldn't we think holistically? I think that mapped out into the rest of the space we're discussing really articulates some of the problem. We need to have, in my view, some sort of centralised pull towards some of these outcomes.
Does that correspond with your idea of comparing the UK with other countries?
In as much as I know a lot about other countries, which is not as much as colleagues, I'm sure, but I mean, if you look at the extreme of China, and nobody wants to have their political system, nevertheless, they do achieve some amazing projects using off-site manufacturing, presumably in infrastructure, for example, at very high rates. Obviously, they have access to huge amounts of finance. That's the other key thing. I think for us, we just need to get a more coherent view collectively of where we're heading, in a way. That's our response to it. And making sure that we do have the investment available to create the momentum.
I think that's a key point, because there needs to be enough of this particularly in the civil engineering and the infrastructure, where it is then worthwhile for people to invest in their factories such that there is throughput, because the price will only come down if there is throughput. And that, so there's a sort of circle here, a virtuous circle. If we get started on this and we encourage people to use off-site manufacture, then the factories will be created, then the factories will fill, and then everyone will realise that's a cheaper and quicker and safer way of doing it, and then it'll move. But it will take a big push, and it takes the bigger clients, government clients, to be honest, are the big clients in that situation, and they're the ones that need to, I think, help us to get to a point where these factories then become efficient. Because if there isn't efficiency in the factory, this won't be cheaper, and we'll go back to doing it the way we've always done it.
I think what's been argued is, what is the planning problem? That is a problem, is it? The planning permissions are not being given.
I think there's enough knowledge of the infrastructure workload now. It takes a long time to come through, and I think it's then key that the government, the in fact public sector clients that look after that have a will to actually move to this type of way of doing it, because it won't come from a private sector client doing something different, because, to be honest, everyone else will carry on as they are. So I mean, with our 4 logistics hubs, we're talking to other programs with an aim of those programs coming with us on that journey, so the hubs become really busy and the factories around them become really busy. So that's fairly early work, but we're keen to make sure that this actually gets embedded and becomes a legacy.
I should declare my interest. I don't have any interest.
Baroness Young.
Could I declare my interest as Chancellor of Cranfield University and Chairman of the Woodland Trust, who have an interest in wooden buildings, and Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh? Lord Griffiths stole my question, so I dreamt up another one, and then you answered it before I could even get that far. So I'm left with the sort of scrapings of what I want to ask. And it's really about this business of scale-up. I mean, where are we on the trajectory of scale-up? Are we really tiny, and it's going to need an exponential increase to get to these levels of efficiencies in the off-site manufacturing process? Or are we halfway there? Or, where are we on the kind of growth curve? And secondly, the idea of government as a driving client. Because personally, my experience of public sector buildings of various sorts is that government's only too keen to step back and let some other agency run with the design concepts, because they really don't want to have the egg on their face if it all goes horribly wrong. So what do we need to do to get government to really act as a large-scale responsible client to help drive this? And should that be in public sector, commercial buildings, non-housing, or is housing a good place to start?
For me, I mean, it is where we have the real gap, isn't it? I think in capacity against the objectives that government has been massively underperforming there. And there is quite a lot of investment going on in various house building companies, which are in some of the case studies that we submitted, showing that they have been able to demonstrate benefits. We have at BRE got a number of houses that are built on site, full-scale houses people live in to try them out, and that kind of works. So the type of off-site manufacture can be quite small scale. It can be done in pop-up factories or in small local units. That contrasts, I guess, with, say, Laing O'Rourke, who've got a Steatley factory, haven't they, working on very large concrete reinforced structures, very specialist ones, more bespoke. So there's a whole spectrum. That's probably less advanced, but some companies are at leading edge. At the housing end, we're probably just a procurement gap away from doing much more of it, because it's not that difficult, perhaps, to set up. I think there was, some other interesting points you raised about the government's interventions, and those of you who've looked at Building Information Modelling, BIM, which of course is mandated as of April, was it last year, or there or before? So for government procurement above £5 million worth has to use Building Information Modelling, which is an essential ingredient for what we're talking about today, but it isn't a necessary, it's an essential agreement, but it doesn't specify off-site manufacture in itself. But the point there is that procurement rules, I think, can be very effective. Now, the residual question around procurement was, when I started thinking about it, sounds great, government procures against certain requirements. Will the private sector follow? Will shareholders of public companies say, government's doing this, so why aren't we doing it? I don't see much evidence of that at the moment, and I think that deserves some research and understanding.
Can I follow that just a little? Let's stick on the private sector just for a moment. I mean, on the face of it, what we're saying here is that off-site manufacturing of houses can be cheaper and better. Okay, right? So you would think that if the market was operating as markets usually do, and you can produce something which is cheaper and better, and there's no demand for it apparently, or no supply of it, then what's standing in the way? This is the bit that I don't really understand.
So I would argue that the forward understanding of the work pipeline is really important here because of the upfront cost of investing in the facilities to produce off-site. And so, I mean, we do start to see some volumetric production in the house building industry. But that forward understanding of pipeline is really crucially important when you're putting in that capital investment around.
But if the demand is there at the end user, in other words, you've got something which is cheaper and better, therefore there should be the demand, why doesn't the production follow it? I mean, or if you're putting any new product in, you have to take the risk of building a factory to produce it. That is a risk, and that's part of the game. It's like any manufacturing game. And I don't see the difference here. I can't see quite what's holding this back, unless it is a whole concatenation of architects, different trades, public sector procurement, planning, whatever. I mean, is it in that area?
I think probably planning and development, developers sitting on land and not developing, doing that sort of thing. The marginal, if that's the right term, the risk, if the cost of the risk, why would I take the risk when I know I can build it, with a team of people doing craft and fitting? Not having a perception necessarily of the extra margins. I mean, the construction sector has been living with tiny margins for years, I think. So actually the culture...
prejudice against prefabs going back to the early days, the post-war days, is that part of that atmosphere of caution?
I haven't perceived it personally, but I haven't necessarily been working in the right sector to perceive the client view. But I do reflect on the fact we don't like wooden frame buildings like they have in the US, which are essentially prefabbed, aren't they, of a panel. We like brick-built buildings culturally. But you can actually still have brick-built buildings with brick facades that look just like a house off-site manufactured.
I would say something about skill sets there as well, the availability of the skill set to deliver in this way.
Fox and then Lord Griffiths.
Professor Watson, you helpfully provided a briefing before this meeting, which is an on-the-record document, and in it, under government actions, you say there may be no immediate burning platform to change technology. In what you just said, you were talking about massive underperformance in building housing, and we know that to be true. So what constitutes a burning platform if massive underperformance in house building is not a burning platform?
I was thinking from a business point of view, from the point of the house builders, they may not see anything that drives them.
Well, I think that needs to be clarified, given this is an on-the-record document.
If there's a way that I can modify that and resubmit, I will do that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think now that you've said it,
I apologise.
No, it's not an apology.
I should apologise.
I didn't recognise the 2 points.
Lord Griffiths.
Mr. Chairman, I should have acknowledged an interest, and that is that I was at one stage a mentor to someone on an executive development programme in Laing O'Rourke. Can I come back to Lord Vance's question, because I think it's really interesting. Because if, for example, I know you were in the retail business and you could see ahead a stream of income, you figured out what your costs would be and you could say, we either do it or we don't, but at least you... To what extent in this area, and since wanting to ask it, my colleague on my left said planning permission is much easier in the north than in the south. And I just wonder whether it's in a way the government intervention in the market through planning permission, which makes predicting the sort of medium to longer term demand much more difficult than it would be if you just had a normal market.
It's not the problem that the planning permissions are not given by governments, by central government, they're given by local governments.
It's true. Yes.
And because if I want to build a new conservatory on my house, I've got to go to a planning committee and get planning permission.
I would just reflect on, I think, what I said before in terms of there's value in taking a central view, obviously with the correct local democracy to balance that naturally. I think that's the point I would make there.
Can I go back to Lord Fox's excellent burning platform search? I feel the need for a burning platform. And I just wonder if the skills thing is going to become the burning platform. Everyone's predicting with Brexit that all these wonderful bricklayers are going to go back to wherever they came from, and that we're going to end up with a lack of the traditional construction skills. Is that wishful thinking, or is that not going to be a burning platform?
I think it could very well be. Actually, I don't know whether we really truly appreciate that. Certainly, to be able to do with the way what we're doing at the moment at the cost we're doing it won't be perhaps possible, because the wage expectations I think might be different between the different nationalities and so on. That could well become a margin driver for companies to have to look for ways of cost reduction. Certainly.
I think certainly in certain parts of the country that will become a driver and already is. So at Heathrow we've started work with Lord Blunkett, who's running our skills task force for us. So what we're looking at is what will be the need for skills as we construct the new runway at Heathrow. And again, it's trying to look at the future as we have been here as what those skills will be, and then work out how we can create those skilled people basically around Heathrow. So working with the local education colleges, etc., to ensure that we're skilling people up the right way so that they can they will be able to work at Heathrow in the future. And so I think if we all carry on as we are, that will ultimately. I think it's a simmering platform. So I need to be honest. I think at the moment we're still able to carry on as we are, and maybe it'll actually start really catch fire in about 10 years' time. It seems to keep on simmering, and people find ways of dealing with, if you like, putting it out rather than it really takes light, if you like.
Is it the fact that it is the developers who effectively control supply that is keeping the platform from setting fire? Because actually, if the supply was to meet the need rather than the developer's ambition, then the platform would be on fire, because there wouldn't be the skills and there wouldn't be the supply chain in order to deliver the hundreds of thousands of houses we actually need. But the fact is, it's the developers who are maintaining control over the supply.
From my perspective, at Heathrow, we want to crack on develop as quickly as possible, and we will add fuel to the fire rather than. So it's not my.
I believe that has been a major issue in housing, and I think government is looking at interventions to cause the release of land for development. But I agree with you, and if you had the step change in demand, then that would tend to drive, I think.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is that 10, 15 years ago, when I was in an innovative manufacturing research centre, we were looking at house building in terms of the sort of single family dwellings. And yet what I observe in terms of innovative approaches to house building in the UK at the moment is in these sort of multi-storey, student accommodation blocks, for example. So HTA Design is doing some of the volumetric blocks in Wembley. It has the tallest volumetric, tallest modular building in Europe, and that's really where the innovation's happening in residential that's multi-family, that's of a reasonable height, that's in urban areas. And that's quite a different problem to crack than the kind of suburban problem.
Yeah, and then Lord Keika moved. Did you have a question?
I did, but I think it's been answered. Though I must admit that last remark I suddenly had Ronan Point in the back of my head, you know, multi-modular, high-rise, North London. Are we better at it now, do you reckon?
I absolutely
You're probably too young to remember what Ronan
No, I
Point
don't.
was.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I take it as a compliment.
I'm thinking about your colleague, actually.
You're going to say, clearly I'm not.
Could I return to the question of research and development, and ask, you mentioned certain areas, AI, robotics and so on. What else might be needed in this area? And particularly, I'm interested in how much are the university departments doing in this area? How much of a focus is there on fundamental research to drive this area of economic activity? Are the research councils involved in it? Is UKRI going to have a lead role in this? Are there going to be challenge funds that focus on developing the knowledge base to develop this area and make it truly productive for our economy?
Obviously, Jennifer from Imperial, I'm from UCL. UCL and UCL East out at the Olympic Park, we've put up a large robotics laboratory which is actually sponsored by the Civil Environmental Geomatic Group. Very interested in on-site automated construction from off-site manufactured pieces, if you like. So how do you actually put them together, which was a point we haven't really covered today. But for example, in Japan, to reduce injuries on site and to increase the speed of working, you can use robots very effectively for construction. Jennifer mentioned UCRIC, which I think is a £140 million investment the government made with match funding from industry, which is putting together the capital infrastructure to enable a number of universities, and Jennifer can articulate which ones, I'm sure, to put together a capability for doing research, and obviously Cambridge as well, across the patch in that sort of area. And I think under the Industrial Strategy Fund, obviously UKRI and others are playing a key part in connecting universities with research technology organisations like BRE and others to put together an integrated capability of people who understand the early technology readiness levels with those who could interpret technology into practice, and then the practitioners as well. So there's more that can be done, I'm certain of that, but actually government is getting it, I think. And perhaps we need to make sure that it is under some sort of collective umbrella that's being not so much managed as making sure communications happen so we don't reinvent wheels.
Okay, if I may, I should also have added at the beginning I have no interests to declare. In terms of the R&D you describe in our own country, how does that compare with global research effort in this area, and how competitive are we compared to others?
I mean, it's interesting because my focus has shifted east, I guess, and so I've been over in Hong Kong at the construction productivity event where they invited some of us over to talk to them. We've been hosting Singapore, and I think both Hong Kong and Singapore are doing substantial things in practice, but are also interested in this in a research capacity. So we work with Hong Kong University. There are interests in this area in Switzerland, where they're doing a lot of work on digital manufacturing. In Germany, there's a lot of good work being done on digital. In the US, of course. And I think, but the UK is seen as a leading player in digital because of the investment that the UK government has made to, as a client into Digital Built Britain.
And I think with building information modelling, if I interject, I mean we are seen as the leader, or we were until very, very recently, and we were quite brave in the government procurement policy around building information modelling, which gives us actually, I think, a lead-in ramp, doesn't it? To being expert in off-site manufacturing.
And EPSRC has invested over many years in the manufacturing area, and so we have a capability in the universities. And indeed, some of that capability was built through the Innovative Manufacturing Research Centres that it funded 10 years ago now. And so there is capacity in terms of the research base, but I think it's really important to sustain that and refresh it towards that next generation of technologies.
And so what actions need to be taken to achieve exactly that, to refresh and to retain that established base?
Well, I think some of the actions are beginning to be taken through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, and I was pleased to hear that there are calls coming out through EPSRC and through Innovate UK and through ESRC indeed, on the back of some of the larger investments, because I think it's important that there are small-scale experiments that are happening across the UK, and that those are a network and that they're coordinated in some way, but that there's the ability for some of the excellent researchers in universities across the UK to do work in this area and to help propel us forward.
Sorry, just one more, Lord Chair, if I may, sorry. Does any of this research effort in our universities, or indeed in industry more generally, depend upon European funding, or is it all specifically domestic funding?
No, absolutely. I used to be the UK representative on the European Construction Technology Platform, and we were seen as key leaders, thought leaders around the research area. We instigated a €2 billion public-private partnership on low-energy buildings called E2B, and I believe also a similar thing around infrastructure, which I wasn't part of, but which my colleague Terry Hill at Arup started. And then the UK benefited enormously from the funding that was available from, or still does, I guess, from, if you like, agendas that we'd helped to shape. And the partnerships with major companies, which we all know very well in the UK, like Bouygues and others, Acciona in Spain and so on, doing collaborative research and sharing outcomes. Thank you.
I was interested in what you just said, but of course one of the things that, again, this committee has looked at is that after Brexit we may participate in certain programs, but we will lose our leadership role. I mean, you see this across the board. But what I was going to say was, I guess there's been a sort of implicit thinking about buildings and walls and so on. But of course, a hugely important part of housing is energy, and really most houses, new houses, small houses, are have independent energy. Is that desirable? Or is that just because of individuals want to do it like that? And obviously the government is very concerned, we all are, about energy use. But actually the way we're doing it, by comparison, as I said, with German public housing, I mean, it's just quite different. And I wonder how you see that.
I think we're on the cusp actually of an amazing revolution, which at BRE we've demonstrated through building, I think there are 3 or 4 houses which have photovoltaics on the roof, but batteries. So we've heard about Tesla and the work that Elon Musk and Tesla batteries. With sort of 10 kilowatt hours of storage, which say in the south of England you can easily get on a sort of anything other than the darkest winter's day, you actually store the energy during the day when most people are out and use it in the evenings. So typically you can almost achieve zero energy imports. And actually when it's even sunnier, you can be exporting that energy. Now the feed-in tariff, of course, is very small. It's been reduced after those early heady days, whatever it was, nearly 40 pence a unit. But nevertheless, if you can actually use the energy you create, and these are all modular concepts, so modular roofs which actually have built-in photovoltaic cells that don't look like unsightly photovoltaics but look like roof tiles, those are available now. Cost-reduced energy storage and management, there's a long way to go there because the volume isn't there yet, but with the increase in the use of electric cars, that technology will come across into the built environment. We could see a real transformation in terms of distribution of energy and very much more autonomy and I would say resilience as well from the grid system, and also give the grid operators the flexibility to turn, to adjust the balance of power so they don't have to increase the rating of conductors.
Used for the energy systems as for basically putting together the beams and the concrete.
I think the assembly, say, of roofs would involve the inclusion of photovoltaic devices and built into prefabricated roofs, yeah. But not the semiconductor manufacturing, that's probably done somewhere else.
Box. You've mentioned en passant the industrial strategy, you've mentioned the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. A key element of the industrial strategy is sector deals. So what should be included in the construction sector deal in order to bring to fruition the promise that we see from off-site manufacturing?
Well, it's a hard question to answer because, of course, we don't have the sector deal draft in front of us. But
draft it.
but I think I would have to push the argument that it's important to have in that the higher skills agenda. And that's around PhD students, it's around the knowledge economy, it's around sustaining and developing capabilities to do to compete in our manufacturing processes, to be competitive in our manufacturing processes. Because we're not. I think the question about international comparisons was well made, because we're not the only country that's noticed the opportunities and the benefits of offsite.
I think I'd also cover the other end of the skills scale, so continuing professional development, the uplift of skills, the maintenance of skills, people changing their engineering jobs, if you like, to match the changing technology. That requires the professional institutions, the universities, to be offering out, perhaps by distance learning, ways of getting on top of these new technologies without taking huge amounts of time out of the working day. And I think the other thing for the Challenge Fund would be funding at scale serious demonstrators. We tend to build something that's not quite enough to convince everyone. Something that really you can't deny. Think about the O2 Stadium or something of that sort of scale that uses a particular approach and clearly demonstrates well-evidenced, measured benefits, which can then pull the momentum through the industry.
Yeah, please, Lord Ross.
But it seems to me that rather than just a sort of sector deal here, you're really looking for a holistic strategy. I mean, you've got here issues which are governmental ones, of planning regimes, public procurement, etc., etc. Then you've got developers' motivation, various vested interests in threatened professions like architects and various trades as well. You've got an R&D and technology bit of it. You've got a whole host of stuff here. There's a risk that you end up, so I shouldn't be answering this question, there's a risk that you end up sorting some of the things that go naturally into a sector deal without taking the holistic view of the whole environment in which this thing operates. Is that right?
I think there is a lot to ultimately change. And with all change, it needs to be taken in bite-sized chunks. And I think the important thing is that the sector deal does pick up some of the points you made, because it probably won't pick them all up. But then ultimately people start using those things and then move on to the next point, because all that won't change in the next 5 years. It will be a steady process, and also we would want to bite off the things that are easier to do first. So it is easier to do off-site manufacture with relatively small bits of concrete and steel, and so do that really well as well and prove that it works, make it completely and utterly digital and it works. So work on some bits that can really be done well, prove they work on a normal site, if you like, in a normal development. So I agree with you. I think to try to solve all this in a one-er is not it. So we've got to pick bits off, and different people have got to attack different bits.
Yeah, but if you don't tackle the market deficiencies, because it seems to be full of market deficiencies, then no matter what you do elsewhere, you aren't going to crack it.
Yeah.
Mayor, you wanted to come in.
Could I comment? Well, I ought to declare my interests. I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and of the Royal Society. I'm emeritus professor of civil engineering at Cambridge, and Laing O'Rourke collaborates with my university. I'm also president of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and I chair the Science Advisory Council of the Department of Transport, who are a major infrastructure provider. And I'm a consultant. I'm sorry, this won't take too long. And I should also say I'm a consultant to Laing O'Rourke, but I don't have any involvement with their off-site manufacture. I'm primarily consultant to them on underground matters, tunnelling and so on. My question is really about distinction between buildings and other forms of civil engineering infrastructure. And I think we've touched on that, and obviously, Phil, your world at Heathrow is not only about buildings and what you're currently addressing, but largely most of the discussion has been about buildings. And I'd just like to hear from the three of you about the potential for off-site manufacture in other forms of civil engineering infrastructure.
I think there is potential in civil engineering, to be honest, just as much as there is in buildings. We have probably, in the past, done more in buildings, but if you go back to the Terminal 5 days, we determined that we should precast 60% of our concrete, which wasn't the actual flat concrete, all the other concrete. So we set a target, and we built river walls out of precast units. People say you would never do that, and a lot of people said we were mad, but we did it. Those river walls are still there 14 years later. They don't leak, and etc. So there's a mindset thing here as well as sort of, you know, proving the case. And certainly for civil engineering, I think there is it's so embedded that you design it, you do your reinforcement, you build it on site, etc. And we need to unembed some of that. And we will be certainly, with the civil engineering which we're about to embark on at Heathrow, we'll be setting targets about how much of it's going to be precast and how much, and whether that's precast in a factory or, as someone talked about earlier, we actually build a little factory near Heathrow and do it. There are different ways of doing it, or we build a little factory near one of our, in fact, logistics hubs. There's lots of different ways of getting at it. It will then encourage designers to think differently, and ultimately what you then get to is you get less wet trades on site and hopefully no hot trades on site, because that's where all the trouble comes, all the danger is, all the joints are, and where the problems come later in maintenance, etc. So I think in civil engineering there's massive opportunity actually, but I don't think it's been tapped into as much as in the buildings so far, because the buildings it's sort of more obvious and you can sort of see bits of it, you know, on the back of trucks, and so and for a long time people have been, you know, trying to do their, in fact, M&E they're in fact mechanical and electrical off-site, and we've done that, and you put them into, you know, big modules, and it's great, and then you plug it all together. But that's again still quite simplistic. There's a lot more we can do to bring together, you know, bits of buildings, and actually I was in Langer Rorke's yard, and they've got whole bits of a side of a building coming out now, and you can see the bits of the building which are sitting in the yard ready to go to London, and they'll just be literally installed. And so I think, and that's a sort of combination between civils and buildings. So I think there's lots of, you know, the last car park we built at Heathrow, multi-storey car park, was 80% built in a factory, and so there you've got the same thing again and again and again, repetitive, and it's built much quicker, much safer, much higher quality, and ultimately it'll be cheaper. I think the cheaper thing, we need scale. It's back to the scale question. We need scale to get it cheaper.
If I may, Chairman, do you think in general that in terms of changing the mindset all around the country, that most of the mindset at present, if it is thinking at all about off-site manufacturing, it's thinking about buildings, and there are all sorts of other projects, local authorities, and which are not buildings, and that's really probably the biggest sort of barrier.
I think there's more progress in buildings. So if you say where we are on the scale, we're probably 10 to 20% in buildings, while we're 5 to 10% in civils. You see, and there's a great example on the A14 at the moment, where you know, a huge viaduct is being built alongside where it's actually being put up. So there are little pockets of the civil engineering world.
Yeah, I mean, I would have brought in examples from Crossrail, so Custom House and so on, and examples of prefabrication being used on major infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
I think both with buildings and infrastructure, there's the problem of how you sequence the people that you bring in to do the work. So I think if you bring designers in ahead of fabricators, then you can end up with an in situ solution that you're then trying to post hoc.
Can I first declare my interest as a property developer, mainly of housing sites, but also of other developments? Can I ask about public procurement yet again, because we've touched on it on several occasions. The November 2017 budget said that the government was going to encourage off-site construction, particularly in transport, health, Department of Education, Justice, Ministry of Defence. But they will all adopt a presumption in favour of off-site construction by 2019. How many of those do you think will actually achieve it?
Good early signals, actually. So seeing the work that Bryden Wood's doing with the Ministry of Justice, which builds on the work that they've done with them around the digital built Britain. You know, and I think digital and offsite, they're not quite the same thing, but they often go hand in hand.
Exactly, yes.
Because they allow you to think about a building, or indeed about infrastructure, in terms of components. And then you can start to think about how you fabricate those. And so I think there's good early signals, if you like, that there's the potential at least for government departments to seize the opportunity for the efficiency savings and you know, all of the benefits that we know off-site brings.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very likely. I think probably that government does provide some very useful signposting, if you like, and I think the infrastructure of, say, research and capability can naturally ease a rather conservative and slow industry towards better places. I think also it's moving incrementally as well, because not only are we doing off-site manufacture, but actually the component manufacturers are coming along quite well as well. So actually, you know, you're starting to see the parts from which buildings are made being very much more accurately made, much more standardization, repeatability and so on. So that's also driving, I think, so if you like, top down and also bottom up at the same time. So it's not such a bad position, I think, in that way, but some big projects will drive further through. One point, if I may, just because I didn't have a chance to respond to Lord Mayor, and that really is around infrastructure. I think, and you know much better than I do, but things like tunnel linings have been made for years in prefabricated off-site ways, and things like footbridges for motorways and all sorts of similar things. But one of the opportunities I think that emerges is that by tracking materials through their life, you can also do closed loop. You can use materials at the end of their life as well, so particularly steel, which is typically melted down with a huge loss of energy or use of energy and a huge inefficiency. We can start to think of a national Lego kit for putting things back together in different ways, potentially. So that's something I think the modularity and tagging of materials with smart devices can assist.
Lord Wallace now bring the session.
So one of the critical factors, presumably, in getting a more efficient, effective building programs, is for the customers to be educated as to what they should expect, what they should ask for, and so on. I mean, you look at us here in Parliament, and we don't know very much, and yet we're making decisions. Similarly, members of councils and all sorts of industries are making very important decisions about this. So, or for example, you take the original, or Heathrow, or the Olympics. Do you think that more could be done to, as it were, you could say educate or to inform, to show them other countries before they make their decisions? I mean, that's my feeling, is that we haven't done very well in creating intelligent customers, particularly for this area.
I think it's absolutely critical that the people who are making those decisions early know an awful lot about their environment, what they want, what they can see as the actual outcome. They understand how the thing works, how it operates, and I think we sometimes leave these decisions to professional program managers, who are people who are very good at getting things designed and constructed, but we need capable owners, I call them, so a capable owner who can really get behind what this thing's for. I've been fortunate. I've been in fact 20 years at Heathrow. So the people who actually run the buildings, operate them, etc., have to put up with what I've done. And so we have great conversations about wouldn't it be better if, etc. And the learning you get through people understanding how buildings and infrastructure actually operate is fantastic. So I think there's a huge piece to ensure that the
Imperial, this program that you were talking about, does that have an element of teaching, creating intelligent customers?
Well, we'd be keen to work with major infrastructure owners, and we do work with the major projects. So we've been doing work which are their delivery clients. So they're not the eventual owners and operators, but they're the owners through that delivery.
But are councillors and other people going to universities or to get some training? I mean, that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well,
but I don't think it's happening, really.
If I reflect on it two ways. One, previous employer, Arup, where when we did the King's Cross St Pancras underground, we fully virtually, with virtual reality, simulated that. You could wear 3D goggles and go up and down the escalators. We could check the signage was right with the client before anything was ever dug in the ground or cut. And then the other side of it, of course, is the very necessary mass training that's needed. And again, at my present employer, BRE, we have an academy. We put literally thousands of people through CPD modules, training, just keeping their skills up and making them fit for...
So, quick question, Lord Wallace, and a quick answer.
I don't have another question, Chair, but I should declare my interest, which I failed to do before, as chairman of the Edinburgh Business School, which is part of Heriot-Watt University, which no doubt has an interest in this somewhere.
Okay. Well, we slightly overran, but I thank you very much indeed for kicking off this inquiry extremely well. So thank you for coming in. We'll have a few minutes where we have a changeover of witnesses, please.
The proceeding is currently in private. 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 The proceeding is currently in private.
Very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and helping us with this inquiry. Before we start, if you don't mind introducing yourself from my left, just so we get you on the record, and if you have anything brief to say to start with about yourself, then please do so. The microphones are on, but sometimes they not very good to pick up, so please can I ask you to raise your voice a bit. Okay. So can I start?
Thank you. My name's Tim Carey. I'm National Product Director for Wilmot Dixon. We're a privately owned main contractor, turnover about $1.5 billion a year. And I chair our national team looking at innovation off-site. I'm also a member of Build Off-Site as well.
Okay. Thank you, my Lord Chairman. I'm Rosie Toogood, Chief Executive Officer of Legal and General Modular Homes. I joined the business about 10 months ago, having spent a 25-year career in Rolls-Royce Aerospace, leading engine development programs, supply chain management and manufacturing businesses. And at Legal and General Modular Homes, we've invested over 50 million in designing and manufacturing and assembling modular homes. We're just at the point where we're going through the final stages of pre-production and about to go into production. And we aim to address the social and affordable housing market initially and the later living products following that.
I'm Jamie Ratcliffe. I'm the Assistant Director of Housing for the Greater London Authority. I'm responsible for a budget of about £5 billion, mainly to invest into affordable housing. I'm a passionate advocate of innovation in the construction industry. I was on the advisory panel for the Farmer Review of the UK Construction Labour Model, and in a personal capacity also wrote a piece for Policy Exchange called Mass Delivery of Manufactured Homes for Rent.
Well, thank you very much. If I can start off, in exploring the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages, or if you prefer, for off-site manufacturing, the advantages and disadvantages, what is it that makes people go for off-site construction? i.e., what are the key advantages they see in going off-site construction? You might also, to the other side of the coin, what is it that puts them off? What are the disadvantages?
In order? Sorry, do you want to do it in order? Or?
No, anybody can start, and all of you can contribute.
Can I go first?
Yeah, you go.
So I think, in terms of advantages, speed is a clear advantage in terms of ability to deliver in shorter timescales. The quality of the products that are delivered is a really important advantage that we can bring, and certainty of cost, more predictability of cost. I think in terms of disadvantages, and I've heard some of the previous panel discussion, it's not easy. There's not a silver bullet to doing this, and it takes a lot of diligence and dedication to get a model that actually works.
Okay. I kind of agree with the advantages. I think the biggest advantage of it is the fact that there isn't enough capacity out there to deliver projects, especially housing, using traditional methods of construction anymore. And we're almost past the point of no return. So we've seen it go in cycles with off-site manufacturing, and it's always reverted back every time we've gone through an economic down cycle. But I seriously think that circumstances are such that we need to be there for good. One of the disadvantages of it is capacity. And I think sometimes the market perception of off-site is something which it's not. So whilst there are a number of larger suppliers, manufacturers like Rosie's company, the majority of off-site manufacturing is still very much a cottage industry. It's still very much men and women in sheds building stuff traditionally, just not at the coalface. And a lot of the off-site manufacturers want to scale up, want to invest, but need certainty. And I think we can discuss upon that later.
I'd agree with Tim's point that there just really isn't an option. So from a housing point of view, if we're serious about building the homes this country needs, we're just not going to do it through traditional construction. And that doesn't mean there's not still going to be lots of traditional construction, but we absolutely need to add to it in new ways of precision manufacturing many, many more homes in factories. In terms of some other benefits, I think I'd stress that point about speed, and I think that particularly appeals to build-to-rent providers, and we're seeing basically everyone in London who's delivering build-to-rent, professional large-scale rented homes, looking at ways they can speed up construction through precision manufacturing of homes, that to them every extra week that they can shave off the construction timeline is an extra week in rent, and that driver isn't necessarily there for sale developers, but it absolutely is for build to rent, and I think that's working well. Another point, picking up Rosie's point around costs, I think particularly that's going to be relevant in relation to small sites, where in London, through the London Plan, we're aiming to see a much significantly higher proportion of homes delivered on small sites, which can be very expensive to deliver through traditional construction. You've got the same overheads on those sites. Whereas if you can have a replicable design that you can kind of drag and drop to lots of locations, you can deliver it much more cost effectively. There's also a macro benefit, I think, in terms of economic policy, that London's where most housing growth is needed, but it's also somewhere that's under a lot of economic pressure, that wages are expensive here, and you can build homes in places where there are less jobs, and you can deliver an economic benefit to those places whilst delivering homes where they're needed most. And I think at a countrywide level, that's something that's really important. Just two challenges, if I may. One of which I think fundamental to the way the construction industry works is it's just really bad at partnerships and collaboration. People don't trust each other, and to make this work, you do need that trust relationship. You do need to work together at an early stage. You need to commit to it. You need to depend on your partners and work through the problems. And for whatever reason, culturally, I think lots of people in construction find that very difficult. You'll also hear a lot of discussion around innovative technologies being not tried and tested, and there being problems with them. But I just don't buy that mostly we're not talking about fantastical things like aerogel. It's tried and tested ways of building homes, broadly 3 different ways. Timber frame, which has been around for thousands of years, steel frame buildings, which have been around for 150 years, and concrete frame buildings, kind of 125 years. They're not massively innovative things, but we need to be doing much more of it.
Fox. We heard from the previous evidence that somehow the development side and the business side is perhaps what's held back the rapid adoption of this technology. The LNG decision gain control of the means of production, if you like. I mean, one can understand wanting to invest in houses as being a revenue stream that sits in parallel with its business. But what was the decision-making process that went on when you were sat around the table saying, well, we're not just going to build houses, we're going to build a factory that builds houses? So how did you come by that decision?
There were two main driving factors. One is, Legal & General is passionate about investing in schemes which deliver socially and economically beneficial outcomes. So that was one.
So you could have done that through traditional manufacturing. Correct,
and we're doing so. We have a number of traditional house builders within the Legal & General Capital portfolio, but we saw a growing gap in capacity availability in the industry and a growing gap in terms of the skills and competencies required to do so. And really, the concept that we are developing at the factory is all about truly manufacturing homes, not building, as Tim said, in a shed, but actually truly getting to the point where we're designing and manufacturing and assembling homes, creating new skills and new capacity for the industry.
So that's real vertical integration as well in terms
Correct,
of what you're doing.
That's right.
Okay.
Henry?
I was very interested in what you said, because at this committee a few months ago, we had people talking to us about fusion and fission, and Legal & General, for example, is investing in one of the most advanced areas of new modular fusion energy and so on. So I'm it seems of a piece that you're very advanced. But my question really is, just go from that to the awfulness of last week in the Times. There was a report of them and others visiting a building site. I won't name the name, but if you read last week's Times, and people, houses were being completed with just plasterboard, and people, feet not surprisingly went through. So, is it in fact mass production or modular production going to avoid the kind of errors or problems that you have with ad hoc methods, as it were, traditional methods? I mean, is that one of the reasons, as well as presumably using more advanced techniques? I mean, when you have a situation such as was reported last week, a very major company putting up buildings, people put all their savings in, and it failed. I mean, and many of them failed. Will the use of off-site manufacture help avoid that kind of terrible situation?
Absolutely, it should do. Any other industry, we wouldn't choose to construct something not in the way that we do in construction. We wouldn't build an aeroplane on the runway, would we? And I think that having access, undertaking the research and development to design the product in the right way, to make it suitable for design, for manufacture and for assembly, creates less interfaces than you would do traditionally as well. So in effect, we should be able to produce the same product and de-skill the circumstances to deliver that product as well. There's also much greater control in a factory environment than there would necessarily be out on site as well.
Fox, and then I'm going to move on to Lord Valence.
Do you take a relatively new entrant in the development market to introduce this sort of rapidly? And we've got two examples really of a long-standing developer and a relatively new developer. Do you think the advantage of being a new developer means that you can bring the new techniques in and it's harder when you're an established developer, or is that just a spurious argument?
I can't really speak for Tim. You can follow me, but I think we have a very positive, disruptive mindset in Legal & General, and a very determined goal here. That's allowed me the freedom to assemble a team, a great team in Sherburn and Elmet, which is assembled from a number of different industries. We've got people from the automotive industry, aerospace, electronics, construction and design consultancy. And we're melding those skills together and bringing the best of the best of the best from those industries to bring new thinking and new ways of doing things, so that we're truly, understanding the customer requirements, taking that into design, really truly getting underneath the designing to a level of detail that's not commonly seen in construction, so that we can actually expand that into a bill of materials and bill of process, as the automakers would do and the aerospace makers and other standardised industries would, and drive the level of process standardisation and consistency and repeatability that's been proven over a number of years to drive up quality. And that's the journey that we're on. So, we've invested heavily to do so. It's not an easy journey to go on, but we're very much we're a long way down the track, and right at the cusp of getting into production and starting to serve in volume the UK market.
You mentioned in particular affordable housing, which is quite intriguing, because one can argue that there is no affordable housing market at the moment. Housing has become less and less affordable as time goes on. And you mentioned in particular in passing the word disruptive. I mean, are we here on the edge of a disruptive technology for the building industry for houses? And is this a step change where you could enter it in a very different way, ignoring much of what's going on in the traditional market, and change the whole thing?
That's certainly what we're about. I use the word disruptive deliberately. We do believe we're tackling the market in a very different way, and certainly designing and manufacturing in a very different way. And that will allow us to scale up the factory rapidly and build it, build in volume.
Is there anything in public policy terms which is holding back that disruptive technology?
I think there's a bit of, so firstly just to say, I think the affordable housing situation isn't quite as negative as you paint it there. I think we're starting to see things change. Last financial year we started the highest number of affordable housing starts in London since devolution of funding to the mayor. There's some high numbers that we're...
In the interest of the committee, can you define what is the price of an affordable house for a couple of bedrooms?
Primarily affordable housing that we're funding is one of three types. For a low rent, basically based on council rents. So for a two-bed home, that was about £150 a week. Secondly, a London living rent product, which is based on a third of local incomes. So on a London-wide average, it varies from place to place, about £1,000 a month for a two-bed property. And
what about the price to buy?
And then third one, affordable home ownership, which is primarily part by part low rents, shared ownership, and the price of that varies from place to place, and you buy a share in it, and you then pay a low rent. But in terms of the income needed to buy it, the average income of people buying those is about £40,000 household income, which is pretty much the same as the average household income across London as a whole. So people who look like ordinary Londoners are buying those homes. But so just coming back to your point on public policy, I think there's something quite significant in terms of the way that housing associations and maybe to an extent local authorities react to off-site precision manufacturing, and that is that they've got an experience of basically being told to do it before. So in the 1960s, the way the subsidy regime worked is councils were highly incentivised to build homes in precast concrete panels. The Housing Corporation in the past basically made housing associations use modern methods of construction. English partnerships through procuring partners on land made people use certain techniques. And that meant they were doing it for compliance reasons rather than being bought into it. And some of the problems that some of them have experienced make them negatively disposed to doing this. And I think it's only when we see organisations fully buy into it and see the benefits, and I think the benefits are around quality and speed, and the arguments of speed that apply to build to rent should apply equally to affordable housing, where you'll get more income in at an earlier stage. And I think some of our partners definitely are seeing that. Swan Housing Association, they've set up their own factory in Basildon using cross-laminated timber. A number of our other large partners are committing significant parts of their pipeline to precision manufacturing homes, but they're doing it because they see the business drivers for themselves and not because they're being told to.
Is off-site manufacturing more helpful for high-rise buildings rather than others? I mean, presumably yes, because the price of land is more than the price of the building itself. So if you're looking at the affordable sector, is there some link between the size of the building you're wanting to build and the use of the technology?
I would argue that with good design, modular housing can address all markets and all tenures.
Yeah, I can see that, but from a London point of view, where land comes at a great premium, and the value of the land is much higher than the value of the buildings, are you looking to having affordable housing in high-rise or mixture or what?
So we've taken off the brakes on density in terms of the London plan, and we're trying to optimise the density in every location, whether that's on very small sites, very large sites, whether that's kind of mid-rise but packed into kind of mansion blocks, or it's tall buildings in appropriate locations. So there's kind of just a mix of everything. I think most of these technologies do top out at maybe 20, 25 stories, although there's a couple of 30-storey plus steel frame buildings in Croydon. One's student, one's for pocket homes who deliver a kind of innovative, affordable home ownership product. So it can get quite tall. I actually do think that thing on small sites is somewhere where we could see it work very well, where you could have something that was very replicable and could be delivered at very low cost. And there's a couple of manufacturers who we've been talking to who can deliver homes at what look like fantastically low costs, kind of maybe 3-4 story, either townhouses or small blocks of flats for infill sites around London.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I was just going to... No, sorry, there was a...
So I was just going to say, I think it's about scale of opportunity as much as scale of building. Most of the technologies can go up, as my colleagues have said, up to the relevant heights. But obviously, one of the barriers at the moment, especially, is there's too many design standards. So, I know it's an often preached thing, but there's a lack of harmonisation of design standards, particularly in the affordable sector. And like anything with manufacturing, the more you can make of one thing.
Whose standards are these?
So registered providers, London standards. There's various spatial standards, a whole spectrum of them. And the problem is, what that does is put lots of different flavours on what an internal layout should look like. So to get to scale, to get to efficiency, makes it more difficult than it could otherwise be. And I think if we could solve that problem, then we could really, get volume.
So my question is, what changes could be made to public procurement processes, in particular for public sector housing, so that we could have more sustainable economic housing? And to add to that, I think one of the points is, which we discussed with the previous one, can we have highly intelligent customers who will, as it were, help this improved procurement process? So that he needs more training of all these different organisations that are buying housing. I mean, obviously you have a specialist branch in GLA, but there are all sorts of people who are involved in making these decisions about housing, and sometimes they're rather amateurish at the moment.
I would say that in any major change, you've always got the early adopters who are the enlightened advocates of that change, who will move first and who will prove out the concept. And we're working with a number of councils, local enterprise partnerships, and housing associations who fit in that mould. And I know Jamie, through his work on the GLA, is encouraging that also. And I think we will start to see groups of councils and local enterprise partnerships coming together. One of the things that would really help is a long-term pipeline of demand. I think we touched on earlier that the fact that keeping flow in a factory is really, really important in terms of driving efficiency and driving quality and improvement. And I think having long-term aggregated demand pipelines in the industry is really important. I think collaboration and changing the way in which contracts are let, that fits with the long-term aggregation of demand. So you're not contracting scheme by scheme. You're working in long-term partnerships with some of the major housing providers. Those sorts of things would really help the modular take-off. And I think also helping promote innovation and skills through technology centres, much like the Manufacturing Technology Centre in Coventry and the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Sheffield. Those sorts of things can provide a real benefit to the industry.
Just asking, in Germany, the insurance companies, I believe, are quite involved in investment. And I just wondered whether Is what you're doing with Legal and General, is that similar to what has been done in other countries in Europe, or is it very new in that sense?
I can't comment directly on that, but
two things were just tying out. First of all, Mr. Carey, you mentioned the standards issue, and who could drive the standards together, and the second point on aggregating demand. Do we just wait for the councils and local authorities and housing associations to do this naturally, or is there something the government could do to bring these things together and create an aggregated demand? Clearly in London there's a big aggregated demand kind of almost naturally, but outside of London, smaller authorities, what could central government do in both cases to drive standards together and to drive demand, to aggregate demand?
Well, I suppose on the first part, I have to profess I'm not an expert on various groups that could be established, but I would say some kind of specialist group, task force, that was charged with working with various interested parties to aggregate up their thoughts and to deliver a standardised suite of harmonised design standards. Similar things have been done in the kind of medium to longer term past. I think if we leave the industry bodies, registered providers to themselves, trying to get an agreement without an external influence on that would be very difficult, I would think. So I do think it needs an independent body to do that for them, or to work with them.
So I'm pleased to say that we've just procured some work, working with some partners of manufacturers, the Large Housing Association, a build-to-rent provider, commissioned Cast Consultancy in Bryden Wood to come up with the beginnings of a standardisation guide, which would address Tim's point, I think, but from two perspectives, one of which is on the client side of how you can have a more standardised layout, which can be more replicable, can be built at higher quality, but also on a manufacturer's side of there being too many small manufacturers who have a bespoke product that no one else can do, and that creates a lack of resilience in the supply chain. If only one person can do something and they're quite a small company, if they go wrong, that's a big problem. And so looking at standardised fixings, having different technologies that can fit together if something goes wrong.
Give us a few details, I think would be quite useful.
Yeah, I can certainly send a link to the outline of it, and it will be progressing fairly soon with some more announcements.
Yeah, then we're working with Jamie on that project with CAST, and we're one of the sponsors of that activity because we feel that standardisation drive is really important. On the subject of aggregating demand, we're also doing work with the local enterprise partnerships and bringing groups of councils and housing associations together through the various industry and trade bodies to try and create a sort of like-minded group of early adopters who will take on board and work with us on developing the modular products. But I think anything that can come from government to help encourage that positively and in favour of modular would be welcome.
Get evidence from the people you mentioned in due course. But can I move on to Lord Borwick?
The planning system is so often the critical path, most of the critical path of a new development. How could the planning system be changed to encourage the use of off-site construction and make it all happen quicker?
In terms of the current planning system, it's agnostic in terms of how homes are built, and through the development of the Draft London Plan, it's something that we looked at in quite a lot of detail. And one of the things we explored was could you give some kind of height reward to people who were doing standardised homes on the basis that you might not get as many homes if you've got a standardised block of things that fit together, and so you therefore might need to go a bit higher. But I think that didn't work for two reasons, one of which is we've ripped up the density standards and we've said that the optimum density should go everywhere, so it's about trying to get as much possible. And also, I think in terms of height, because the technologies do top out at a certain level, it might not be that useful to give somebody a height reward. So within the current planning system, I think it's quite difficult. In 2014, I spent some time in California, and they've obviously got a very different planning system to us, but their system of accreditation, which was kind of somewhere in between our planning approvals and building control, they were carrying them all out in factories, some of those factories in the Far East, or a long way from California, and able to give certainty and predictability through their equivalent to the planning system by doing that. And it feels like we should be more open to some innovation in that space.
Okay. As far as the concerned, what changes would you suggest in order to not to keep it agnostic, but actually to bias the system in favour of off-site construction?
I think the work that we're doing on standardisation will help. I think we find that working with the early adopters, the positive mindset, we're able to get through the issues that we need to get through and deliver.
Lord Fox.
The government's industrial strategy has involved a number of different sector deals, and it was announced, I think, in November that there's going to be a construction sector deal. I think the details are still emerging, so now is your chance to try to feed in what should the construction sector deal focus on in order to deliver the promise that we're hearing for off-site construction.
I think if it's announcing new pots of funding, I think that's not necessarily the most helpful thing, because some of the previous pots of funding that have been announced haven't been deployed.
The information is around pots of funding for things like new construction methods and things like that, so there is an element of that.
But so for example, the Accelerated Construction Fund, we've been talking to government for well over 18 months about London's share of that, and whilst I've been told there's been progress made, there's no confirmation of here is the money that you're going to get, or we can get on and do something. We've said we would like to use that money very much to drive much more precision manufacturing of homes, and it's caught somewhere in the machinery of government. If more pots are announced, then they take just as long.
But why?
Point made.
Can you explain why this reservation about introducing higher standards? That's what you're saying, isn't it? That you want to have a higher standard of construction, which this off-site methods will deliver. But you're saying that there's some problem in government about that.
So just deploying funding of the kind of, in London we don't have an automatic share of pots that are announced. We have to negotiate on a case-by-case basis, and sometimes it takes a very long time for us to get our share and be able to do something with it. And the Accelerated Construction Fund is definitely one of the slower ones in my experience.
And funding is competitive.
Other thoughts?
I would say we need a new sort of mindset in the industry, a new industry approach. So I'd like to see more collaboration, more long-term contracts, less adversarial contracts. More interdependence and less power within the relationships. From down the supply chain, longer pipelines of secure demand, so we can plan and resource and invest and improve the products, and more investment in innovation and skills. One of the key things we're doing is building capacity in the industry, bringing in people and multi-skilling them, making them able to do a number of different tasks rather than giving them just one skill or trade. We're also developing new skills and trades. So, more advanced understanding around architecture and design for manufacture, and investment in that space, and more investment around the logistics and manufacturing flows and manufacturing engineering, and investment in innovation and skills in those spaces would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, really. I mean, I think the kind of the research and development into technologies remains an ongoing demand for it. I think the more we push higher standards of construction, higher thermal performance, higher efficiencies of everything else as well, then that will, in effect, force us to use more methods of construction, as the traditional ways of constructing houses can no longer meet those requirements. So I think there's a useful lever there. There's some kind of incentivisation for higher levels of thermal performance would be a big thing. I think the frameworks thing is a big thing as well, and we need to acknowledge, I mean, as a main contractor, there's a kind of there's a disparity between the requirements that I need to fulfil for my customers in terms of providing 3 quotations for a particular trade, and my desire to partner and provide a meaningful pipeline to an off-site supplier. And that goes back to trust, and it goes back to evidence. And I think the key thing for me in all of this we talked about, effectively we're asking a customer or an end user to make a different decision, to elect to support the use of off-site rather than something that they know and may think is a better option. And we don't collect enough data, enough output data on projects. And this is something that we're working with Syria on to try and collect data, because if we're asking someone to make an informed decision, they need to be informed. And I think some kind of lever, again, that we could put in place whereby we can capture outturn data from projects so that we can prove that where we use off-site, we have benefits, we have less defects, more time certainty, lower costs, repeatability, etc.
This seems to be a marketing issue. I mean, is it a marketing issue that Legal in General are addressing?
I think it's a change curve. You know, and as I said earlier, you get early adopters who absolutely get the modular benefits, who are passionate about that and who we're working with. And, you know, as we gain momentum in that space, I think the market will move.
But we do need to bridge the adoption gap. And I think data, again, sorry to reinforce it, but I think data will help us to get over that. And we need to be more explicit about marketing. We still talk in the industry about a World in Action report that happened in 1983 back in timber frame. And that's years and years ago. We need to reinforce the positive messages about off-site and the outturn impacts that it can have as well.
In a way, it's not so much construction as manufacturing and assembly.
Yeah.
So that's the step change.
Absolutely.
Okay. Lord. So it's carried on from really the previous discussion. What reskilling of the construction workforce is required to facilitate a change to more off-site manufacture for construction? I just add, one of the points we haven't discussed very much is the fact that obviously where you put your houses makes a difference. So if in some areas that I know of in the UK, valleys in Devon and other places where, you know, it's much more difficult to put up houses. And, you know, is the use of off-site methods going to be just available appropriate for nice level areas where you build them, or are we going to be able to use these new techniques in many of the areas in Britain where people live, which are actually quite demanding places with complicated floods and slopes and so on? Will the new technologies be available for those areas as well?
I don't know much about Devon, but if I just take the first part of your question, I think if we had a reskilling challenge, that would actually be a nice problem to have. We've actually got the opposite, which is dramatically reducing construction workforce. The Farmer Review found that due to the age profile of the workforce, huge numbers are retiring and not being replaced. There was what he called a burning platform, and that was before the referendum on leaving the European Union. In London, according to official statistics, and we think it's actually much higher, half the workforce are from overseas. There's a massive challenge without the certainty of what's going to happen when we leave the European Union, of having any construction workforce at all. Whatever's left there, we're likely to need to keep building in traditional ways. And so what we're looking at in building in factories is being more productive, so needing less workers per home that's being built, but also attracting many more new people into the industry who will be attracted to working in different places. And I think, for me, that one of the key benefits of moving more homes to being precision manufactured in factories is that you can attract a more diverse range of workforce. Currently only 12% of the construction workforce in the UK are women, so we're basically ignoring half the population in terms of the workforce that we want. Having a safe, dry, fixed place of work where you can have split shifts, you can be more flexible, you can have more oversight, should be appealing to women, and we should be able to get greater gender balance in the workforce, which is one of the things we need to do.
Want to follow up? No.
Can I ask about the issue about off-site manufacture potentially hampering architectural ambition? So the sort of perception that somehow having standardization of components means standardization of the end product and preventing architectural interest. You know, could you say what your views are about that?
I don't buy it at all. And I was booed out of the AA School of Architecture a few months ago when I was talking about standardisation of having standard elevation, standard fenestration treatments. I was in their building in Bloomsbury Square where the entire thing is standard, and you've got one of the most beautiful parts of London. So I think some of that's overstated. I think the other thing that's overstated is according to the numbers that my team pulled out for me, there's just over 1 million terraced homes in London. Pretty much all of those are a standard design. It's 2 up, 2 down with an outrigger at the back. Yeah, there's a huge amount of variety you can do within that standard design. Many more of them actually have been converted to flats, so it's probably more like 1.2 million or something in terms of that standard building that can be converted. And I think what we're starting to see, I mentioned the Swan factory earlier, that through manufacturing and having standardisation, you can have mass customisation. You see it in car manufacturer, which Rosie might want to say something about, obviously knows much more than me. But Swan, through their initial site where they're offering houses in Basildon, are offering consumers 288,000 options in terms of things that they can vary. And it's very easy for them to offer those options because they're just swapping out different components within the factory. And so you can have variety, you can have flexibility, but you're not sacrificing how beautiful the building looks. You can finish them externally in what you want. You can have a range of different interesting things happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add that, you know, in many other industries, standardisation is seen as an enabler, you know, a building block for, you know, the added extras and the flair. And, you know, our intention is to create the standard building blocks in terms of the modular design, but also be very sympathetic to the individual housing association, council, local enterprise partnerships needs in terms of creating a different street scene, different orientation of the actual housing, and different fascias and roofing to create nice places to live. And that's, you know, how we intend to work with our clients.
So there is a role for the architect still in implementing design locally.
Creating nice, you know, great places to live, absolutely.
Just a point here, we are actually conflating two things here. We're conflating off-site construction and standardisation. Are you saying that standardisation, which has all the benefits you've just described, is impossible to do with on-site construction, or is it, in a sense, that conflation? Do you have to have the off-site delivery to deliver the full benefit of standardisation, or is there an agenda that says standardise on-site construction as well?
I think it's both. I think there's definitely benefits of standardising on-site construction as well.
But it hasn't happened. I mean,
it hasn't. It may not have happened widespread. There are pockets of good practice where it does it. You know, where we don't have to keep reinventing.
I mean, I'm suggesting that off-site delivery forces standardisation, whereas on-site delivery, it kind of sort of drips in from.
But you just said there are hundreds of thousands of permutations you can make. So
yeah, but it's through a standard.
I think the thing about mass customisation, platform-based approach is you get the benefits of both. You know, it's off-site will drive the standardisation because inevitably, if you're going to design a system from the ground up, you're going to design it with standardisation of components in mind. You know, and in terms of, you know, the role of the architect, there will always be a role for an architect. Designing standard components doesn't mean that you don't need an architect skill to assemble those in an elegant, beautiful manner. It just means that you spend your time on that element that matters to the end users and the surrounding vernacular, rather than worrying about how you build a wall or how you build a ceiling time and time again.
I think it's about discipline. Absolutely, standardisation would deliver a range of benefits through traditional construction, but because there's no real, no massive cost you can see of just tweaking something or doing something a bit differently, people do. And so like, there's a site with about 700 homes built so far that we've been involved in, where there's 368 different property layouts. And I don't think that's an architect who's been employed to make a toilet in a slightly different place or a corridor look a bit different, has been utilising his or her skills particularly well. Whereas getting something right, replicating it, would have delivered lots of benefits on a traditional construction. I think you probably don't get all the benefits of the quality, the oversight, the precision that you get from building homes in factories, but you can go quite a long way through standardisation.
Lord Mayor, follow
up this point. I mean, Mr. Ratcliffe, because you're of the three of you, you're a client. Would you be giving preference to off-site manufacture in your design briefs to your architects, to your in the business of producing houses? Is that something that you now would see as a preference?
So we don't directly procure any homes ourselves. We mainly fund third parties like housing associations or councils who would be building homes themselves. I think the point I've made before is I think the client has to adopt it, and so I wouldn't want to put rules on our grant that made people go in a certain way, but certainly we've been trying to create a strategic environment where it makes sense for them to push people to deliver homes at speed, at scale, which drives you towards these types of things.
Those organisations that are clients are beginning to get the message about the advantages of off-site manufacture, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
So I think I'm by nature an optimist, but it does feel like we're on a point where we're going to see much more precision manufacturing, and I think the build-to-rent sector driving that, but lots of forward-looking housing associations who very much want to do it at scale as well, and so just some of those with large sites who have signed up to ambitious build programmes who need to deliver at pace are basically, because they've committed to that pace, are therefore committed to looking at delivery in a different way.
Anybody else want to add? Lord Renfrew.
I was very struck by the point made earlier about harmonisation of design standards standing in the way of off-site construction in some cases. And that, or resistance to harmonisation of design standards, I suppose. And that really surprised me because I've been trying to understand what has impeded the more rapid adoption of off-site manufacture. And that was, I think, the strongest argument that I heard, that I see that could be an impediment to plans being adopted. Is that a fair comment?
I think it was me who made the point, so I would think that's an entirely fair comment. I think, I see that as one of the biggest barriers. Because at the end of the day, you can still do it, but it won't be as efficient as it could possibly be. And I think, I'd agree.
And I think it's how much of that variation is conscious and actually value-adding to activity. And certainly my hypothesis is very little. It's kind of people tweaking things because they can. A designer who's asked to produce a new staircase makes up a new staircase each time.
Yes, thank you.
One of which I asked before, what about energy? I mean, an extraordinarily important part of the buildings are the energy. In the sort of public sector programs you're doing, are you ensuring more uniformity of the energy systems in the houses, or can people choose all their different heaters and refrigerators and other devices, or is that going to be an area in which you can have regularisation and more efficiency?
Yeah. So we believe the way in which we're designing and precision manufacturing these homes makes them more airtight, delivers homes of a higher quality, and therefore, and the use of the fabric first approach allows us to deliver homes which are more energy efficient in the long term. And I think that's driving up standards in the industry across the board. And in terms of adopting new energy systems, the factory manufactured environment allows us to look at innovations in the way in which energy is captured and then stored in order to be able to take homes off grid and be able to deliver new energy solutions.
As I understand what you're saying, it still means that you'll do all this insulation, but people in different houses in a big block will actually use their own different energy devices, whatever it is. Whereas in Germany, there seems to be much greater standardisation of the energy supply in their public housing. I don't know. I wonder whether that's important.
I'm not an expert on it, but I could certainly get somebody to write with a bit more information on our policies in relation to decentralised energy and how that's applied, and that we have adapted the approach in the latest draft of the London Plan. But it's something that in the right places with the right demand of energy, we're certainly promoting a lot. So if it's helpful, I can get some more information and provide that.
New York, for example, it's well known. You have centralised heating, which has extraordinary contribution to efficiency. And we don't do that in England, really. It's just relying on neighbours' heat or whatever it is, but it's...
No comment on that. Well, I think our time's probably up, and you've helped us a lot. So can I thank all three of you for taking time out to come and help us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.